We have a huge problem in this country with science denial, and people really need to recognize that, while these incredible technological leaps come because of the vibrant scientific and engineering enterprise we have in the United States that needs to be supported and protected.
I think there is far more diversity among scientists when it comes to their own attitudes and approaches to, let's call it, spirituality.
My guest today is scientist Dr. Adam Frank. Adam Frank is a leading astrophysicist, astrobiologist, and professor. But he's more than that. He's a boundary-pushing thinker who asks questions that shape the foundations of what we think we know. As a professor at the University of Rochester and a NASA researcher, Frank is at the forefront of the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, probing not only the science behind life on other planets, but also what it means for humanity if we find it. Here on Earth, Frank is a prolific author with books like Constant Fire, exploring the connection between science and spirituality, and The Blind Spot, which argues that human experience and sacredness are as essential as science in understanding the unknown. In the Little Book of Aliens, Frank takes the readers on an eye-opening journey into how discovering alien life might upend our worldview. As one of America's leading public intellectuals, Adam Frank bridges the divide between hard science and the profound philosophical implications of our place in the cosmos. Well, Adam, first I want to say thank you so much for being on my podcast. By the way, you are the first scientist I've had on, and I'll also admit this: I'm such a big fan. You were the only scientist I went to. So here is my question, Adam. What does science get wrong about religion, part one? And what do you think religion has gotten wrong about science?
Yeah, well, I think, when we say science has gotten wrong, the question is, what do we mean by science? Because of, and I always want to distinguish between science as just this, human discovery. Science is a way we've discovered to be in dialogue with the world, versus the organs of science, or popular authors who claim to speak for science, right? You have to be very, one has to be careful of that. And then also the history of how some of this debate has played out. I think when it comes to the popular discussion that you'll find, out there in books and YouTube videos and such, what the side of science often gets wrong is it's sort of this monoculture fallacy. It's sort of the idea that, like, religion equals fundamentalist, sort of literal readings of the Bible, right? Of the Christian Bible, as opposed to, there's a bunch of other documents out there, but that's really what it is. That, so fundamentally, when you see people talking from the science side, talk about religion, it's like the only thing they've seen is Inherit the Wind. I don't know if you know that movie, Inherit the Wind.
Sure.
Your watchers do as well, which is an enormously important movie for me when I was a kid. But that's sort of, they're trapped in that sort of like, religion equals this small southern town that has this literal interpretation of the Bible, and they hate evolution, and without recognizing that there's actually religions have a wide variety of approaches. Any particular religion, American Protestantism, has a wide variety of approaches, and so it's that sort. I think that's what science, or what in the popular discussion, gets wrong, not recognizing that.
They put when scientists are speaking in a sense against religion, or religion's appearance that it is against science, when science speaks against that, religion then gets put in a monolith, basically.
Yeah. I think it's like I said, it's the only thing they can see. When Richard Dawkins goes on about religion, he is thinking of like a few very specific versions. He's going to be talking about, again, this sort of on Christianity side, fundamentalist, literalist interpretation for Islam. It's going to be a very particular kind of Islam. Buddhism never even gets mentioned. When it does get mentioned, it's mentioned in a weird way. So it's just, that's the problem. It really doesn't understand, it doesn't understand sort of the history of human activity in the domain of spirituality. That's when that first book I wrote, that's what I was really exploring, how rich that is. So that is what, from the science side, is gotten wrong.
But let me ask you a more forensic, maybe personal question about that. If that's a categoric understanding, which I think is pretty accurate, even viewing from my standpoint, in your actual experiential world, as you've been in the science world, and you rub shoulders in these lanes with brilliant scientific people, is that still the same? Is it changing? Is it, or no, it just operates with that bias, whether it was 40 years ago or 40 minutes ago?
I think there is far more diversity in among scientists when it comes to their own attitudes and approaches to, let's call it, spirituality than is normally given. However, I do think, I think overall there still is this sort of sense among scientists that, sort of that there's a discomfort, let me put it this way, with the domains of spirituality. It's unclear how to talk about it. Even if people are not what I would call scientific triumphalists, which is the idea that science could explain everything.
Right.
Even if they're not in that, there still is a bit of an uncomfortable. Not many scientists that I know have active spiritual lives or actively pursuing a path. Lots are, but it's just not. It's not talked about. So it's
and I would say from my, I still consider Christian spirituality my language, and I can even admit that it might be a construct, a human construct, but that language is still how I connect with something transcendent. But, in deference or empathy to the scientists, it seems like maybe the scientific exceptionalism, and I'm sure that has its ills, is partly reacting to a religious or a doctrinal exceptionalism or triumphalism, correct? That there's been this battle. No, we're right. No, we're right.
Yeah. Historically, for sure. And that's really where, how we ended up here today is a particular narrative about science and religion, some of which for sure is true. I mean, the archetypal story of Galileo going up against the church, right? Giordano being burned at the stake, which actually he wasn't burned for his astronomy, but it was part of it. Like some people will be, we can go into Bruno because he's.
I think you said because he was also an a-hole, right? A royal a-hole.
Exactly. Yeah, part of the problem. Everybody's holding him. So
there's plenty of people I've wanted to burn at the stake for the same reason
because they were a-holes. Yeah. So, and then, obviously Darwinism, the appearance of Darwinism, there's, battles with the church. So, these have been there for sure. It's part of the narrative of the emergence of science. But there's parts of the narrative that are hidden, which are, that don't get discussed. Like, for example, in the early 1800s, lots and lots of scientists were actually parsons. The early practitioners of scientists, many of them were actually religious, and they thought they were doing the work of, God's work in some sense, in doing science. Newton wrote more about the Bible than he did about physics. There was a much more subtle interplay.
Totally.
The narrative we often get, but I just think it's undeniable that there's been a tension between them, which shaped where we got today, particularly the one which when I wrote the book was really interesting to me. The whole name fundamentalism, I didn't realize this, came from these 12 or 21 books called The Fundamentals.
That's right.
By an American Protestant pastor.
Correct.
And really so much of it was a reaction to what was happening in science.
That's
like
right.
it was a whole new version of religion that or of Christianity that emerged in reaction to science.
No, you're spot on. Spot on.
To see sort of like there was this, this interplay going. It wasn't like religion was always just sitting there and then science came along and they were in conflict. Actually, aspects of religion morphed in response to what was happening in science in opposition. So, it's actually quite subtle.
No, you're right. And by the way, Inherit the Wind, I love that film too. Spencer Tracy is unbelievable. Come on. And right. But, it's interesting, Adam, how this relates, how the actual Scopes monkey trial relates to talking to you and even a lot of my audience. So when when the state of Tennessee is suing this high school teacher because he's teaching Darwinianism, we all know what actually happened, which is the teacher lost and the state of Tennessee won, and religion, it was a religious fight. But what's interesting, so then a lot of evangelical religion then won the century. There's no doubt it won the century religiously and maybe saying common America. But this is even my beef against my own world. Then theology stayed the same, but all the other ologies developed and developed and developed and developed, while the doctrinaire said, well, theology can't develop like biology or any other ology. That by the time you got to the end of the 20th century, a lot of the sons and daughters who were raised in that, but also had ears in their public universities, their private universities, their public school education, as the century developed, they're holding this religion that was giving them answers that didn't change to a culture that had woken up. Is that?
Well, it's interesting when you say that because, for me, the Scopes monkey trial and this is sort of the telling that I got of it, as a kid of the Inherit the Wind, was that while the state had won, it had actually lost. The battle had been lost. Because you remember, this is so interesting. The bank says, the head banker says to the judge, listen, you got to shut this down because I'm not going to be able to get loans from those big banks in the cities, right?
Yeah.
So look, sure, okay, we're gonna rule against the teacher, but in fact, the culture as a whole, and I think this is kind of the narrative, moved on. The culture as a whole said, no, we're not going to hold on to this, religious literalism. And it moved on. And so much of the history of the 1940s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, the rest of and I think this actually has played out in politics so much, moved on and accepted that, okay, you're going to figure out however you want to have a relationship to God in Protestantism, great. But it's not going to be this literalist, no evolution, no science thing. And then part of what would happen later on, which maybe what you're talking about, is that in the 90s and such, we start getting that pushback from the fundamentalist groups, right?
Yeah.
Fundamentalist religion, which, as you said, the sons and daughters may not want to be part of, but also it triggers now this next wave of the new atheists, right?
Yeah,
so in the early 2000s, you get Dawkins, right? And you get Sam Harris. And so it was this back and forth sort of between two groups who wanted to have the fight, where kind of everybody else had moved on. Like most religious people were like, yeah, look at the Pope, right? The Pope's like, evolution, what's the big deal?
Yeah, right. Totally.
So that the rest of the culture had moved on, but these two groups were still fighting it out.
That's right.
And of course, the religious fundamentalists, from my point of view, were trying to grab hold of political power again.
Yeah.
Once they did, so.
No, I agree. And, by the time it seems like scientifically the big mic drop in let's say once modernism happened, is the big mic drop is obviously Darwinism.
Yeah.
So religion has been able to continue to stay in a mythology that whether it was East Coast elites or whether it was flyover country. They could hold on to that. Once Darwinism happens, and the whole idea of the Enlightenment, whether you start getting political philosophers, scientific discovery, by the time we get to the early 20th century, right, that culminates with the monkey trial in Dayton, Tennessee. But you know what's interesting, Adam, as a theist, and again, my construct and language still being Christian spirituality, when I listen to Dawkins or the late Hitchens or even Sam Harris now, when I listen to them, I go, I agree with everything. As a theist, there is nothing they say that, in that sense, I go, I'm on the same team. I'm trying to at least stand up for something less than a literalistic, what we call in theology a biblicistic. That's our fancy word for literalism, a biblicistic perspective. So as a scientist, Adam, what does religion get wrong about science?
Yeah, I think, I had a rabbi once say to me, I gave a talk somewhere, and a rabbi said, the first 6 pages of the Bible, or of Genesis, were not meant to be a cosmological theory, I mean, that's not what they were told. All, the idea that your religion is supposed to contain the facts about what happened to the universe is like, kind of, for me, missing the point of what spirituality, human spirituality, is about. I once did a debate. I somehow got involved with a debate with a literalist, somebody who wanted to, we were going to argue about science versus religion.
Right.
I looked this guy up, and he was going to come at it with like, look, the Big Bang shows that Genesis happened. Right. And, I went after him by flipping the script because I have, my spiritual life is very important to me. I said, what kind of crappy religion do you have that if, like, this theory of the Big Bang were disproven tomorrow, you'd be like, well, that's it. I'm giving up on my religion because it's been disproven.
That's
like,
right.
Your response to the world, the response to the world that is a response to sacredness. And that was the word I landed on in my book as I got to spend like 6 months a year in the religious studies department reading the classics of, religious studies. So sacredness was sort of the word I ended up with. But like, why would you give that up? Because some facts, you don't do it because of facts, you do it because of your response to the world. And so somehow religion has to fight with science about facts. I mean, to me, all scripture is poetry, and it's speaking to an aspect of being human that has nothing to do with whether or not, a telescope shows that the universe formed 13.8 billion years ago or has an infinite beginning, has no beginning in time.
Well, it's interesting. They, as the 21st century starts, and there is a shift in the American religious and specifically what you think of popular Christianity, the kind of Christianity that won the 20th century, the sword they lived by is now the sword they're dying by. And here's what I mean. When the Enlightenment happened, and one of the chief concepts of the Enlightenment, being reductionistic about it, was reason, right? We started to think reasonably. And as reason started to threaten religious doctrine, then the doctrinaires go, I don't even know if they realized they were doing this. They now took systematic theology and they made it reasonable. So now the Bible has a reason, like we have a reason for everything, and then they can use their literalistic, biblicistic theology to be reasonable. And I think this brings back to your point. If your religion is now just based on reason, what if a higher reason answer comes and knocks out that thing? What are you going to do? Right. In your book, in this book, which The Constant Fire, where you talk about the historic debate between science and religion, and you talk about kind of some silliness, some explanation. What are some of those silly polemics that sometimes the Christian religious apologetic world uses that just make scientists go, "Oh my gosh, you've got to be kidding me"?
Well, yeah, it's been a long time since I wrote the book, so I have to remember sort of, what I meant by that. But I think what I was really talking about was sort of, the attempt to sort of dance around, like, a lot of things would, like, say the age of the earth, right?
Right.
Or and that's a perfect example of what you're talking about with reason, right? So Bishop Ussher, I think, begins this thing of like, oh, we're going to count backwards, by the prophets about when the earth began, and it began on, 4,627 BC at 3 p.m., right? Which, again, was exactly what you're talking about, this idea of trying to apply reason to the Bible, as if it was a historical document whose every page, validated something that happened.
But there's a lot of people still in America, Adam, that still believe, they hold that belief.
Right. Which to me, and it's always so puzzling to me that then they're calling on their cell phones, or they're sending email, or, adding a comment, arguing for that position, using this device, whose whole basis is the chain of understanding nature, such that, of course, the universe wasn't born 4,000 years ago or 6,000 years ago. There's no way the universe could have been born 4,000, or the earth could have been born 4,000. And it's like this weird, sort of like cognitive dissonance, where, like, I'm going to live in this world full of science, which is constantly, showing me that you can enter into dialogue with nature and get certain kinds of answers. And then I'm going to pretend that answer doesn't exist if it comes into conflict with a set of dogma,
right,
of beliefs, I was told.
Yeah.
That's the silliness that I don't understand. And people, what's so sad about this for me is that there is a way to have a spiritual life. There's no conflict, to me, between having a spiritual life and having a scientific life.
That's right. Yeah.
Get on. It's just what you expect.
It seems like your premise, which I totally agree with. You talk about the debate, you show it historically, but there's also, like, what gives? Why do we have to be debating this? And Adam, even in my theological world, and it's also niche, but there are no theologians, ministers, at least in my lane, that hold to a young earth viewpoint.
Right.
There isn't one. So, but Adam, what do you do from the scientific world when that world, whether it's talking about biological evolution, as an astrophysicist, I'm assuming you hold to there's an interstellar planetary evolution, of course. So when they produce their scientists, and they do produce their scientists, and some of them have PhDs from elite universities, what do you, as a scientist, what does that do to you?
It's funny because I've also been involved very much in the debate about climate over time. My first job I took a year and a half off after undergraduate. So in 1986, before anybody had heard climate change, I ended up working in New York. First, I was a bike messenger. I did all kinds of crazy, stupid jobs.
Fun. And you're living, and you're alive.
And I'm alive. Yeah, I was actually the bouncer at the Rocky Horror Picture Show on the 8th Street Playhouse, which was a strange.
In the height of Rocky Horror, like when everything's getting.
This was 86. Yeah, it was like quite on the weekends, and very strange story. Yeah. So anyway, I was doing all these crazy jobs, and I wanted a job that was more doing science. This story has a point.
Oh no, I love stories.
And I got a job working at a climate facility on 113th Street and Broadway, right over the diner in Seinfeld. Which
wow, yeah, Tom's Diner. Yeah.
Why is there a NASA facility on 113th and Broadway?
Yeah.
So anyway, that's when I first learned about climate. One day I asked my boss, like, what are we doing here? I was doing scientific programming. And she sat me down and said, well, we think the climate might be changing. And
This is what year? Late 70s?
No, 86.
86. Okay.
86. Long before anybody had ever heard of climate.
Right.
Climate change doesn't really enter the consciousness until maybe.
Are we even calling it global warming then, or not even that?
Yeah, I think it's called global warming. Yeah,
Okay.
I think it was called global warming.
All right.
I'm not even sure what they, I'm not sure
Right.
what they actually use. But so she tells me everything they think which is going to happen, which has all been borne out. And that's my introduction to climate change. So the reason I'm telling you this story is that in the mid 2000s or late 2000s, I started doing a column for NPR where I did a lot of climate change stuff. And then there was all this climate change denial, right? So I started to really have to encounter denial, people who were saying like, no, that science is wrong. This well-established science that all the scientists are like, oh yeah, we totally understand this. Having this group of people being like, no, it's either a hoax or it's totally wrong. And every now and then, pushing a PhD, a guy with a PhD saying like, you're wrong. And so I had a, fair amount of experience. And the interesting thing about climate denial, it took a page out of evolution denial. Like they were clearly using the Discovery Institute's kind of playbook for how to deal with, how to discredit science, So the reason I'm telling you this whole story is, when a scientist encounters this kinds of thing, there's two things you can do. One is you can try and explain to people why that's wrong. Like, let's go through all the science. Let me show you the facts. Let me show you the history.
Right.
And of course, there's always going to be one or two. You can explain to people that science is a community. You have 1,000 scientists. 998 are all kind of part of the consensus and working this direction, like climate change or evolution. And you're always going to get one or two people who are like, enjoy being iconoclasts, It's the nature of human being. And they're going to be like, no, everybody's wrong. I'm the only one who knows. And so, the main way we work at this is to try and just explain. That's our job, is to explain why that one guy who's saying evolution is not true is just like, here's the 10,000 reasons he's wrong. He's ignoring, he's made all these arguments. We've already disproven them. He's ignoring that we've disproven them, right? He's not answering the responses. But here's the thing I really found. After a while, it's pointless, right? Because what? You're not really interested in the answer, right? Just like with climate change, the evolution deniers, they're not really interested in the science. They have a variety of reasons why they're holding to this view.
Right.
And it has nothing to do with the facts or the theories it's either tribal, right? This is their tribe. Their tribe doesn't believe in evolution. Therefore, they have to not believe in evolution. It's political, which is also tribal. Or for whatever reasons, they really want to be outsiders. They gain something psychologically from being outsiders. So the main thing I've learned from this is that it's not about the science. So trying to argue the science with them is a losing battle because, science, as I said, is really a dialogue. It's a way of getting into a conversation with nature that we found will produce objective results. Objective meaning I do the calculation, you do the calculation, that person over in India does the calculation, we all get the same answer.
Yeah.
So that method we've discovered sort of rules for doing it correctly. And these people aren't interested in those rules. So it's just an endless, it's not worth it. It's really not worth the top.
Yeah. And I think the same about theology. It should be a dialogue. I think it should evolve and advance. A theology that evolves or advances isn't what's wrong with theology. In my mind, that's everything right with it. And even if someone has a cosmic divine view, it seems weird that you just go, yeah, we're done here. We figured it out. Now all these other things, as you go, your cell phone, your television, your computer, the fact that you and I can talk to each other in two different states. Oh yeah, we'll accept that. But as far as God, big, now we're done. We figured it out.
And, the thing about it is, of course, especially that's what I'm trying to say, with scriptures or with sacred texts, they are always poetic. And I mean that in the deepest sense of the word. Yeah. Poetry is, I read this somewhere and I love it. It's the boundary of the expressible and the inexpressible. See, that's where, I get into conflict with my scientific colleagues. not everything is reducible to a mathematical equation. There's lots of being human, lots of aspects of being human that science doesn't reach. Not all things that are true are scientific truths.
Mm-hmm.
So, I could imagine with theology or philosophy, I'm very involved in philosophy, you're always interpreting, and as societies change, as perspectives change, you come up with new interpretations. And as long as you're arguing, and this goes back to our point before we were talking about before, as long as you're arguing in good faith, right, then it's an interesting, useful, and fun discussion, right?
Yeah.
And the good faith is the part, because with the evolution denialists and the climate denialists, they're not arguing in good faith. Like, no matter what you say, they're not going to argue in good faith is, I make a point, you in good faith try to respond to that point. If I have an argument that you're really flummoxed with, you're like, okay, I get that, I concede that, right? And science is all about, science is like playing blues music. It's a call and response, right? The guitarist plays a riff, the guy on the harp plays a riff in response. It's always a back and forth. And bad faith is when you stop responding. And who wants to play with a musician who just you're playing a riff in, D major, and this guy's like, I don't care, I'm just going to keep playing, in E. And it's like, oh, that sounds horrible. So it's like, I can imagine with theology, same thing. Are you in good faith? Is this a good faith discussion?
Yeah, totally. And Adam, I'm a minister, so I'm going to hate to do this to you, but can I give one quote from Jesus of Nazareth? And those who live in Western society, regardless of their background, will certainly know, because this has etched its way into a colloquial understanding. But it's when Jesus is teaching his followers to follow the truth, and it's that famous passage where he says, everything from you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. Now, what's interesting, that word, the Greek word is aletheia. And this is what I try to say to my hyper-literalist friends. That word aletheia doesn't mean some doctrinal, dogmatic truth. It means what's actually true. So what I try to teach my congregation is we are to be pursuers of what is actually true. And what is actually true is what will set us free. Not you will know some doctrinal, dogmatic, already decided upon way that we then say is the truth. This is why in my congregation I have ditched the word truth, because in my world it has so much baggage. We'll just say true or actually true or what's trueness.
It's funny, aletheia. I'm familiar with the word aletheia because of my work in phenomenology, in the philosophy of phenomenology, which was so much about, phenomenology was this attempt to sort of unpack, not deduce, not reason, but to actually explore what experience. What is it actually like to be an experiencing agent? And aletheia is a word that was used there. And in there, it's about uncovering. Like aletheia is the revealing, the ongoing, moment to moment revealing of the world itself. It's not an equation. It's not a statement. Because really, what good is a statement? When people are like, I want the meaning of life. Oh, okay, here, it's 42. What good is that? Our lives are continually, they're ongoing. And any truth we have has to be found in that dynamism, right? That dynamism of the world constantly uncovering itself. And so, what you don't want is some sort of dead, list of things on a page. Does that actually help you when you're suffering, when someone you care about has gotten sick, That's
right. That's right. And what is actually true is endlessly knowable. It means I can discover what is actually true about something in my ancient time, postmodern time, and then 1,000 years ago. But it's endless knowability that I will continue to learn more about what is true. It seems like that. It seems like science is better at that than theology.
Well,
true.
Yeah, again, I think science has its domain where you can apply the methods of science, then, my God, it's incredible. And it is unending. The questions just lead to new questions, But science is not amenable to everything, right? Particularly in, the domains of, there's aspects of experience that, doing an experiment is not necessarily going to tell you anything, especially when it comes to, again, these, that's why the sacredness, the experience of the sacred, I can go and see which parts of my brain light up. Like they do this with meditators, right? Buddhist meditators.
Yeah.
It's great. You learn a little bit, but you're not actually learning anything about the sacred experience, the experience of sacredness itself. Look, even if I'm biting an apple, right? Sure, I can see this part of my brain lights up and everything, but that doesn't really tell me anything about the actual experience of biting the apple. I'm learning about what is called the neural correlates of biting the apple. But experience itself is that aletheia, is that revealing.
That's right.
And it is bottomless. I think it's endless. There's no end. For me, I'm a Zen Buddhist, so I sit, I do lots of contemplative practice. It's not like I stand up someday and I'm like, well, that's it, I'm done, I've gotten everything there is to get. Right. There's a great line that today's enlightenment is tomorrow's mistake. I think that really sums it up.
Yeah, right.
Spiritual life goes from the beginning to the end.
And built into that phrase seems there's a built-in humility to it, right? And there's a theologian I like, Richard Rohr, and when he talks about transcendent mystery, he'll say transcendent mystery is endlessly knowable, meaning the irony of spiritual mystery, you can know it, it might be experienced, it's embodied, but yet it's mysterious, but it's not like it's the old biblicistic answer when someone has a question and somebody can't answer it and he goes, well, think the things of God or the divine are mysterious. That is saying something is not knowable, but endless knowability or transcendence or sacredness. It's like, gosh, I'm experiencing this.
Yeah.
So I know it by experience, but yet it's still mysterious to me. Does that make sense?
Oh, God, totally. Because the fundamental mystery is this ongoingness. It's the ongoingness, right?
That's right.
So I experienced it yesterday, and now, and now it's a memory, right? That doesn't really, that only helps me so much right now, right? So, you have to you constantly are finding your way back into it. There's the 4 vows that are said at the end of every contemplative session in Zen. And one of them is Dharma gates. The gates into the, into the Dharma, into the truth, are boundless, right? But the way I like to interpret it is boundarylessness. They have no boundaries, right? There's no, they just kind of keep going. There's always, you can enter, a gate, the Dharma gate, but you're going to enter it again and again, and they don't have any boundaries. So it's this ongoing, to be alive is to live in this field of openness, and that openness is fundamentally mysterious. And one of the things I learned when I was writing the book, and I went and I talked to some people, some classicists, about the Greek Elegian mystery cult. I was interested in where the word mysticism came from. And she told me, she said it meant hand over mouth, which I thought was interesting, because it's just the idea that, look, there's some things that you can experience, but you can't really talk about them.
Totally.
That's why poetry, right? That's why you need poetry. So, you're not going to get a literal account for some of these things. You're going to get poetry which will point to the moon, as we say in Zen, but it's not the moon itself,
So, yes, no, I'm so glad you said that, because I do have a question sort of like that, and it's about what is effable and what is ineffable. But let me set that. I'm going to come to that in a minute. And I want to talk, if you're willing to talk about a bit of your journey. So I found an old video of you on YouTube where you were talking, I think, about religion and faith. But one of the things you offered as an aside, you said, I'm an atheist. And by the way, let me just say this. I have a spirituality that I don't really care if people are atheists. I don't view that as less. But I'll get to my point. I just want to offer that as an aside. But here's my point. It's okay that this is true of me. That is how I described myself then. But here's how I describe myself today. So you've also been telling us about spirituality, Buddhism, Zen. Well, what do you consider yourself now here, this day?
Yeah, no, now I wouldn't have probably said, when I wrote that book, I probably wouldn't have that was like 2007. And in my own evolution, I wouldn't have called myself then a Buddhist. I would have said I'm practicing, because I've been practicing for years.
Okay.
But now I'm totally like, I'm a Buddhist. Like, I'm a Zen Buddhist. That's just it, And the thing about Zen Buddhism, this is what's so interesting. And it shows the variety of ways to approach this. Without doubt, some people in the West will be like, oh, Buddhism's not a religion, it's a psychology. It's like, no, it's a religion. It's got all the aspects. Go back and look at Zen in Japan, Chan in China. It's a freaking religion, pardon my language.
No, it doesn't bother me.
Got all the pieces, right? But it's an atheistic religion, right? It's a religion that doesn't have a deity, right? It's got the, what's the word? It's salvetic, right? It's about salvation. It's got rituals. It's got a place for transcendence. It just doesn't have a deity, who is, choosing to, so that it's you can pray to the Yankees this year, the Mets next year. It's never the Mets.
Right. Never Mets.
Never the
especially this season. Yeah.
Well, we're half game out of maybe being in the wild card, so we'll see what happens. But so Buddhism is a religion that has all all the approach to the sacredness, but without a God. And it just sort of shows you that you can have these things. There's lots of ways to approach. What matters is the experience, right? It matters is the experience of what I'm calling sacredness.
Yeah.
Of the more, that this is not reducible to a bunch of statements, a bunch of facts, that there's an aspect of being alive that just calls to the more, the oceanic feeling as or awe, right? As who is it? The theologian Rudolf Otto. That was one of the things I read for that book. And I was really amazed by Otto's, this was like 1905, Otto's insight that, the experience of awe is this fundamental experience of which many scientists will cop to. Lots of scientists are like, oh, I feel awe all the time. Not realizing hey, that's actually a religious feeling.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask, because you use the words, certainly you use the word sacred. I'll offer, well, let me just get your thought. How do you feel as a scientist, and maybe a Zen Buddhist scientist, how do you feel about words like sacred, transcendent, spiritual experience?
Yeah, I'm cool with all those words. I think we should talk about what they mean. We can unpack what they mean. Certainly many people in my world in science are very uncomfortable with those words. But what I loved about, the reason in the book I really landed on sacred, I didn't know this. Sacred actually refers to Roman temple architecture, right? In Rome, if you're back in Rome 2,000 years ago, there was the Caesar, which was the interior where the statue of the god was, and you had to be attentive to the gods when you were in the Caesar. Out in the profanum, right? Sacred and profane. Out in the profanum was outside where you could sell great lead tapes, and your nuts and your berries and, whatever. So there was the Caesar and the profanum. And I thought that was just such a beautiful sort of, the sacred is our response, this ancient response to the world, that where we are attentive to this quality of being alive that is open-ended, that, points to the more, that is reflective on the fact that our lives end, which is really weird. And then the profanum is the part where we don't, we're just going about our business doing whatever.
Right.
So I thought sacredness.
That's good.
A great term to describe this.
Yeah.
And, spirituality, I chose not to use spirituality or focus on it too much because I'm trying to find ways of describing this that would offer new ways of thinking about it. But, transcendent, sure. Transcendent is that feeling of there being something more than just what is directly in front of you. And to me, the transcendent, this is what's interesting about Zen. Zen, there's the absolute and the relative. The relative is the everyday. The absolute is that thing that we're pointing to in spirituality, but they're the same thing. They are immanent. You can never have one without the other. It's a huge mistake to focus on one over the other. So, yeah.
Yeah, no, I love it. And when I was my world religion class, my professor, he would say, I'm a Christian Buddhist. And in my last 10 years, maybe 15, there have been parts of Eastern religion that, of course, I just, they wake me up as true. It's true. So let me ask you then, with maybe both hats on, which is your science hat, but then, of course, your experience hat. And I'll preface it by saying this. One of the things, Adam, that I see happening in American Christianity, and whether you're looking at a Pew poll, a Gallup poll, you know, the 20th century American Christianism is certainly being challenged already in the first decades of 21st century America. And there are many of us who have left that world. I was a evangelical minister for 30 years. Yeah, and then and so there were intellectual issues. I couldn't do it anymore. There were philosophical, actionable issues of love that I just couldn't. The exclusion of gay people was hugely problematic for me. And then, of course, all the politicizing of religion. There were many, many things. But for most of it, for me, it was intellectual. But and I don't know if this is going to matter to you, but it does relate to what you were saying a moment ago. One of the things that I think is breaking down as Christianity moves into its third millennium, and by the way, what do I know? So this is just my opinion, really. What do I know? But it's moving away from classical supernatural theism. It doesn't even know it. But the reason, while some of these doctrinal answers are not working for maybe at least the Western world and specifically Americans, as they have woken up throughout the century and more in this century, the answers of classical supernatural theism just are not working. But then choosing to be a non-theist or an atheist is also then not the answer, because sacred, transcendent, unknowable, knowing endless mystery is still important. So back to the effable and now maybe an astrophysicist planetary evolutionary question. And then you tell me where I get the science wrong, because Adam, do you think... Well, let me back up this way. When I hear biologists or people that understand forests and stuff, they may talk about how a certain forest can have a collective intelligence.
Yeah.
So if a forest can have a collective, obviously if humanity can have a collective intelligence, if a forest can have a collective intelligence, maybe a planet in its evolution has a collective intelligence. Maybe that expands into the universe and planetary systems have a collective intelligence. Are scientists open to the fact, or do they think that just evolutionary happened naturally, or there is some potential, not a doctrine, some potential ineffable energy, thing, entity that is beyond naturalism And then back to the forest. If the forest has a collective intelligence, is it just natural, or could there be something beyond naturalism, some ineffable concept behind that?
So, in our new book, In the Blind Spot, right? One of the points we were making, so the subtitle is Why Science Cannot Ignore Human Experience.
Right.
And the thing to understand about, like, the idea of natural versus supernatural is that you already have to be in the world. You already have to be an experiencer, to formulate the world into that category, to say, oh, there's this thing called naturalism. There is nature, and this is what nature is. Nature is out there, as opposed to in here, whatever in here means. And that category itself, that way of formulating, that view of nature is actually the result of a particular kind of metaphysics about the world, which has forgotten aletheia. It has deliberately pushed experience out to the edge, because in order to have science, in order to have that kind of approach, you have to already be in the world experiencing. You already have to be embedded in what the phenomenologists call the life world. And so what I would say is that the categories, when you're sort of structuring that, what I might imagine is that as science moves forward, is that what really we're going to need, because that idea, the naturalism, and I don't want to compare naturalism to supernaturalism. I think supernaturalism falls to the exact same problem of sort of like, oh, we've forgotten sort of what requires, to me, what we've required, the real myth. We've forgotten the real mystery, which is not whether God exists or not. To me, it's what is. And again, this is aletheia. What is this revealing, this already present revealing? What does it mean to be present? What is presence?
Yeah.
And from that may come what is required is a different view of nature, a different understanding of what nature means. And what I mean by that is a nature that includes us, that starts with us. And then, maybe, you'll be able to build an account of some of the deepest questions we have. What is life? How did life start? What does it mean to be an autonomous agent? The universe itself. How do we view the universe from the inside? What part, what role do we play in the universe? That if you had a different conception of nature that started with that central mystery of like, holy crap, I'm here. We're all here. And I'm not just here alone, right? I'm here with you. I can't be me without you.
Right.
Because I can't use language. The only reason the only reason I think of myself as Adam Frank is because I'm part of a community. I was born into a community of language users. And that community of language users is part of an ecosystem of life. That ecosystem of life is part of the biosphere, which has been around for 3.8 billion years. There's no separation. There's no way to sort of pick one out and say, oh, look, here's this dangling single entity that I'm going to call an individual, And so there's what is required, what we were trying to argue in the blind spot, is that we've kind of reached the end of a particular metaphysics about science that says, oh, you're just a meat computer, this kind of naturalism, and you're just, everything can be explained via natural systems, when it forgets that, like, well, what do you even mean by natural? Where did that word come from? What is the assumptions and blindness in that word? So I think what's possible as we move forward is a scientific view of life, and that will account for presence, that actually will understand that there's that the bottom drops out, right? That your explanations are good for what they're good for, but there's always going to be sort of like an infinite, sort of emptiness below it, where where the scientific accounts fall away.
Right.
Always about experience. It's always about us as a community of experiencers.
No, as a theist, there's nothing you've said that I disagree with. I totally agree with that. Is Adam, is this what John Vervaeke calls transcendent naturalism?
I don't, maybe, right? We've talked about it as natural constructivism sometimes. But I want to be, when we wrote the book, it's funny because when we wrote the book, we were like preparing for the fight because, our view, we're both, there's two scientists and a philosopher who we wrote this book, and we were going to be heretical, right? We were waiting to, for them people to come after us with it.
Yes.
But in fact, actually, the reviews we've gotten, from in Science magazine, in Nature Physics, in the Wall Street Journal, were really positive. So I was like, you can't be a heretic if nobody wants to set you on fire.
Right.
What we're trying to resist a kind of, a naming, because I think what we're trying to do here doesn't have, it's not going to fit into the categories, right? When, I'm sure like within theology, and philosophy, this is certainly true. There's these poles, right? Idealism versus materialism, right? Or physicalism, analytic versus phenomenological. And I think what we're trying to say is like, this whole project would be, you've got to like kind of erase and start over again. And especially drawing from some sources that really, at least like for the debate we're part of, that never get drawn on. So again, what's called continental philosophy, the phenomenologists. For us also, the philosophies of classical India and Asia, something that's called Eastern philosophy, but it's really, there was Vasubandhu that, it was, 3rd century BC, India, Nagarjuna, these are like the Platos and Aristotles of this other civilization,
Right.
They had ideas about causality, about identity, about logic, very different, from what emerged out of the Western core of, civilization. And that, take these ideas and you're going to end up with like something really different that could be really useful for all of us. It's a kind of a new pluralism. It's a kind of an epistemic pluralism that understands there's a lot of these different views and you may need all of them to sort of kind of do your best to corral, and you'll never fully corral this question we're trying to ask, which is about ourselves and the world.
Yeah, and specifically the Abrahamic religions, their theological explanation, they latched onto classical supernatural theism, which, I think that's what's breaking down. It's sort of like God is like me, but he's not like me. God is almost like Superman.
Right.
He's like me,
right,
but he's not like me.
Right.
And he can fly into my world and fly out of my world and do these supernatural things. And I think as we become more aware, back to your illustration, as more things that become true in this layering, as we discover, you go, that lens I was looking through just does not, it's murkier and foggier. And then when someone just goes mystery, it doesn't.
Yeah, right. So there needs to be like, I think, and across the world, right? Especially now that finally the world is like, sort of very this one community, though it always was, right? Christianity was getting affected by Buddhism, and Buddhism and Hinduism. There was these currents,
of course,
flowing back and forth from India to
that's right,
Eurasia.
That's right.
So
that road that traveled, and then by the way, I have plenty from my former world that would, of course, that's the supernatural part of it. They go, no, we're the only ones.
Yeah, and I think that's, again, this sort of I think it's going to have to happen naturally. The world is just, the world is changing, and it's, we're a global culture in a way that if we're going to survive, that there's going to be, there's just naturally going to be these mix of ideas. And, right, one of the stunning things, right, as I'm sure you're, this like drop off in religious identification in the United States, around the world. And, while some people may be like, yay, I'm like, in general, as long as, I don't think literalism helps anybody, but also we do have to have a connection to a sense of sacredness, or else we wander in weird paths.
Yes, that's right.
That void hopefully is going to be filled in a way with new, creative. This is why I like Karen Armstrong so much. Her writing.
Right. Sure.
Attention to the fact that, people change their interpretations of Scripture all the time. Scriptures are not some kind of like rigid document. So that across the world and all the, that there's going to be this change that has to happen now.
Yeah. And that's that is what's happening. That's what's happening in the American Christian landscape. Now, as you know, when a certain doctrinal dog gets backed into a corner, it can start to gnarl. Yeah. And if we've elected those people, the gnarling and the growling as we're seeing it. And just from any historic, whenever religion has gotten in bed with the empire, it has never gone well for the religion, ever. And I think, at least the lanes I'm in, now that's one thing to be involved. It's one thing to be involved politically and as an activist about certain issues that one might feel important by. But yes, I think getting in bed with the empire is not a good thing. Yeah. And then my interpretation of Jesus's teachings, Jesus is like, if you see that, run. Yeah. Run far.
Caesar, what is Caesar's?
Yeah. Well, let's get into some of this other cool work that you are involved in, which is you're looking for alien life, right? Are you looking for little green men? Tell us about your work and finding what's happening out in our universe.
Yeah.
What are we looking for?
We're looking for biosphere. So for the first time in history, we have the capacities to do like a really, thorough search, which we really haven't done before. SETI was something different. Also SETI was never really funded. So, there was not a lot of SETI work. But for the first time, we actually are going to have the telescopic technologies to find evidence of biospheres, of large, scale deployment, or that's the wrong word, of life. We're going to be able to see, life on a planetary scale by looking at other planets. We only found these other planets, maybe.
Yeah. So, Adam, for my audience, explain what a biosphere is. This is looking out at the universe and looking for biological imprints in other planetary systems.
What the history of Earth shows is that life is not some sort of like green scum floating, impotent on a planet's surface. Once life forms, if it's going to survive, it has to take over the planet. It literally hijacks the planet's evolution for its own ends. The biosphere, there's an atmosphere, right? The atmosphere is the thin shell of air, of gases around, the surface of the planet. The biosphere is the shell of life. Life is everywhere. You can go 20 miles below the ground and you'll find huge numbers of bacteria munching away on rocks. Basically the biosphere is the sum total of life, and it has changed the history of the planet. The best example of that is oxygen. The only reason there's oxygen in the atmosphere is because of life. If all life went away tomorrow, pretty quickly the oxygen would react away and Earth would have an atmosphere of only nitrogen and some carbon dioxide.
So are we getting close? Are we getting close to seeing this?
Well, we have the tools now. That we're just developing to be able to see what we call biosignatures. We're able to see the signatures in the light from a distant planet of there being a biosignature. So a biosphere there. So like oxygen is one, right? I just said, like in Earth's atmosphere, somebody could look at Earth from a distance, from 10 light years away, and know that there was a biosphere there, because they'd be like, oh my God, I just detected oxygen in that planet's atmosphere. There's got to be life there pumping that oxygen in there. So in the next 10, 20, 30 years, we are, putting stuff in the sky, telescopes into orbit on Earth that have the capacity to probe, to be able to take the light from a distant planet, to first A, find the planet, and then B, pull out its light from the starlight, and then be able to characterize it, and say like, oh my God, there's oxygen, there's dimethyl sulfide, there's, whatever, methane, and be able to tell like, yeah, there's a biosphere there.
So, Adam, paint a cosmological picture for us. Is there somewhere out there in the universe, waves are crashing against a shoreline, there is some warm wind blowing down the walls of a canyon, there is some sun setting with brilliant colors in the sky? Is that a worthy cosmological picture?
Yeah. And I think at this point in time, science has shown us that what you just said is absolutely true. that picture. There are absolutely trillions, literally trillions of places where exactly what you are describing happens. There is snow falling over, valleys between canyons. There is, as you said, there's waves crashing up on beaches. There are planets that are just all ocean, just 100-mile deep oceans. Now the question, so those I think we've had definitively answered, or based on what we can say that is absolutely positively true. We're like probability 1, yes. What we don't know, and is still a giant question mark, on any of those worlds, is there life? When that snow is falling, is it falling on something like a leaf? Something like grasslands, something like our bacteria. That's what we don't know. And so that first question, are there other worlds? That just got answered in 1995. So that's still a new. When I was in graduate school, I couldn't have told you whether this idea of all those worlds, those trillions of worlds, whether they existed. Now I know.
We know.
And now the next question we're poised to answer is, are any of those worlds hosting life?
And then what is, if that's the biosignature, what is the techno signature? Are we looking for that too?
Yeah. That's actually what a lot of my work is. I'm the principal investigator on NASA's first grant to look for, to start thinking about techno signatures. Our team, we have an amazing team of people. And techno signatures are just the technological equivalent. So, we have enveloped the world in what you would call a technosphere. All the wireless communication, all the satellites, there's just technology, and it's the fruits of technology, have changed the planet. Climate change is the most obvious example of that. And that is visible from a distance. And so what we're now doing is figuring out what are the best signatures that we could find looking at other planets of a technological species. One, for example, could be industrial, what we'll call industrial, atmospheric gases. There may be gases that were purposely put into the atmosphere, things like chlorofluorocarbons that only technology produces, that could be in the atmosphere for a variety of reasons that someone might purposely have put in the atmosphere. And we could detect them. We could definitely detect them from a distance.
Yeah. And, Adam, from in my God economy, and also love and appreciation of science, man, I just want to believe that there is that there's life out there, and an intelligent life, especially when you say there's trillions of these. But as you know, we started this conversation. I know we're winding down here. We started this conversation with talking about the debate between science and religion, and we do know there's a particular religion out there. If suddenly we discover life or intelligent life out there, oh boy, do I have to change my whole religious system? Yeah. And you and I are like, why would you have to do that? So I'll end with this. I'll go back more philosophical, and that is, and I always, maybe this is the poet philosopher in me. And Adam, one of the things I hold, and I what do I know? I just think that love is the central energy, the central force, is certainly experiential, of the universe. And I got to ask you, a scientist, because I'll say this to my congregation, but I read some things you wrote in your book, and I go, oh no, maybe I better not say that anymore. But one of the things I'll say to them, and I'm trying to compliment scientists, but maybe it's not doing that, but I'll say this. I'll go, if you want to hear and listen to the real theologians in today's world, don't listen to the guys like me. Don't listen to the seminary presidents or the preachers in the pulpits. The real theologians in culture today are the astrophysicists, the quantum physicists, the molecular biologists. But then I read in your book where you were talking about how some even Eastern religions, I think you mentioned Deepak Chopra, start using, oh no, there's love in the universe and quantum entanglement, and all of these quantum definitions show it. So am I kind of saying the wrong thing when I say something?
I mean, listen, the idea that, I was actually asked this recently by a kind of a science guy. He's like, okay, so what is the meaning of life? And I said, look, bro, it's love. It is. It's love.
Yes.
And it's even fun. And I don't need science. And that's what I mean. I don't need to have this proven to me via some scientific theory. This is where not all truths that we experience, not that we hold, that we experience, that we have an experience of, have anything to do with science. Love, the meaning of life is love because it's funny, within contemplative practice, within Zen practice. I came because I wanted enlightenment. I wanted relief from suffering. I also wanted to know the deep truths. But one of the things you realize with practice is, as somebody once said, you came for enlightenment, you come out with compassion, that you can't do it. You can't actually gain that deeper, wider knowledge of enlightenment of the universe without first having, the road leads through compassion for everybody and every living thing that is suffering. It's suffering just in trying to endure life, trying to go on, to continue. It is hard. It is suffering. And that compassion, I think, is elemental. And I don't need a proof. I don't need science to tell me that's true. I've experienced it,
Yeah, and same. And by the way, for my audience, this is so encouraging for them to hear from a gifted, brilliant scientist. It really is. And by the way, of course we know there's love out in the universe. Didn't Captain James Tiberius Kirk show us love is everywhere? A lot
of love.
That's right. Yes, he got a lot of love out there. And absolutely. In fact, one of my favorite, were you a Star Trek fan? I mean, the original.
The original. I saw the original. It used to come on in reruns twice every day. Every day. I've seen every episode of the 3 seasons probably 50 to 100 times.
Oh, same. And, I know you got to go. We'll have another conversation because we didn't even talk about as far as, searching for life in the universe versus the whole pop culture of UFO and UAP life. But I was just watching that. One of my favorite episodes is, remember when Kirk has to fight Gorn? And Gorn has those slow motion. And I was thinking, if aliens are like that, they are not going. We'll be able to kick their ass because Gorn is so slow.
Kirk does this particular move, right?
Yeah, totally.
There's a commercial where the two of them. This is there's a commercial that was done 10 years ago.
It's the game. It's for the Star Trek game.
Oh, not again.
Hold on. That's right.
Wait, and they get angry at each other, and then they're like, it's okay, here we go with the fight, and he does that overhanded.
Yes. Yes.
Excellent. Most excellent.
And by the way, through Star Trek, this is our last one. I'll say goodbye. One of my favorite. Do you remember Landru? Landru is they show up on this planet. Kirk and the gang show up on this planet, and it's this planet that is run by this computer.
Oh, yeah. Wait.
But religiously, doctrinally, and convinces them that it's God. And they have their version of a Mardi Gras. And then as Kirk moralizes and pontificates through the episode, which I always loved.
I love Kirk.
Oh, yeah. Nobody better. And, he gives, Roddenberry, he gives a statement. He's making a statement about a very doctrinal faith and to be open to science. So, well, Adam, thank you so much. Yes, your latest creation is The Blind Spot. I left you have another newer book, The Little Book of Aliens. I left it out at my desk. And for anybody that's interested in the conversation between science and religion. It's this book, Constant Fire. But I am a big fan, and if you go to YouTube and watch anything that Adam is on, and because you are an affable, likable, but so brilliant in taking these deep concepts and making them very human, like you did with love at the end. So, Adam Frank, thank you so much for being on this.
It's a great conversation. I don't usually get to talk about this. It's very important to me, so I really, really enjoyed it. And let's do it again. I would definitely be up for having.
Yes, let's have another conversation again. Adam, again, peace.